Okay, so congratulations, you're beginning to get into module 2. And this video is a partner, if you like, to the video that you ideally, if you've done this in order, have already watched, which was not me, but another amazing chap who brilliantly describes the stress bucket and does such beautiful, simple drawings that I thought, you know what, he just does this so well that I wanted to use his analogy because he does it so well. And so this video is diving deeper into some of the things he talked about to add detail and clarity. But before I go into that, I want to emphasize what this particular module is about and what it encompasses. This is quite an intense module with a lot to take in. And so, whereas the last module was very light, very relaxed and fun, hopefully, this module does require some thought. This is a lot of conscious activity going on in this module. I keep saying model. Why do I keep doing that? Module, Shirley. But don't panic about, oh no, I need to get it all in. You know, what if I don't get it? What if I don't understand it? What if I got... This is a module you want to keep coming back into. Remember, the chap on that video and people like me and him have been doing this for years. We get this. This has become unconscious for us. It's quite simple, but I don't expect you to take this all on board straight away. However, this module and this part of this module is fundamental. It is critical to your success, not just in this process of reinvention that you're going through at the moment, but for maintaining your sense of well-being, your mental wealth, as I like to call it, now and for the rest of your life. So really pay attention, really dip into this often until it starts to feel like osmosis. It comes out of your pores. Right, that's it. Let's move into what this particular video is about. So here is the video you should have already watched. If you haven't already watched this video where this chap explains about buckets, he calls them of resilience, I call them stress buckets. I like his positive reframe of that. If you haven't already done that, stop this video and go back and watch that one, because this one will make a lot more sense if you listen to his first. So assuming you have done that, we shall continue. What stress is and why it matters. He doesn't go deep into this. He talks about sleep, but I'm going to define in a little more detail what it is that's particular about sleep and how it impacts on stress and whether we have stress or whether we don't. I want to dive a little bit deeper on how our brains define stress. Again, he talks about trauma, but please don't feel that, oh, I don't have trauma. Oh, this isn't trauma. No, this can't be me. That's the only thing I would criticize about the video, that it suggests that maybe this only applies to trauma. This applies to any and every kind of stress or unconscious block. But I want to just dive a bit deeper into how the brain defines that. I also want to look at the kinds of activities and thoughts that create stress. Again, he's talking about specific trigger events that actually reveal a lot of what I'm going to dive a bit deeper into here, but don't add as much context as I want to give you here. And then I want to layer that with talking about sensory information and pattern matching, which he does refer to, though he doesn't use that language. So that's what we're going to do. Let's kick off with sleep. Not all sleep is created equal. He talks about how important sleep is at emptying our buckets. But he also just skirted over talking about how sometimes sleep doesn't do that. And I want you to have a bit more understanding of why that might be the case. So the part of sleep that manages our stress that I personally, though neuroscience is a very new science, we can't prove this, but I personally think that the size of our bucket relates to how much REM we have. Now, I could be completely wrong. However, if we stick with this analogy, everybody talks about different size buckets. So we all have different capacities for dealing with stress. And part of that, like most things in life, part of that is genetic, and part of that is experiential, environmental. And that's the bit that we're interested in here, because we can't do anything about the genetics, but we can do a lot about our environment and how we respond personally. But it helps to understand, I personally think it helps to understand what's behind this. So REM, if you aren't already familiar, is the rapid eye movement part of sleep. And if you know about this, bear with me, because I'm just going to explain it for those that have never heard about it and don't really know what it is. It's not easy to see it in ourselves because we're asleep when we experience it. But if you have pets, this is the easiest way to witness rapid eye movement, REM, in another mammal, because all mammals, and possibly all creatures, I don't know, but mammals certainly all have this. And what you'll do is you'll observe a cat or a dog when they're asleep, and you watch their eyes start flickering, and they might start jerking, and they might even start making noises, and you might go, oh, they're dreaming. And they possibly are dreaming. But that is what we call REM. And REM only happens for short bursts of brain activity through the night. So if you set someone up on a brain PET scan so that you can see the activity of the brain, during REM sleep, the brain becomes hugely active. So although we're asleep and we think we're just chilled, we're just relaxed, not doing anything, during REM, our brain is hyperactive. It is really, really busy using vast amounts of energy. And that's when we regard it as emptying the buckets. So it's moving information around, and it transfers short-term memory into long-term memory. And I expand this by talking about, forgive the dings, it's my computer, by talking about short-term emotional memory. In other words, I felt this today, but I don't need to carry all of that emotion into tomorrow to be able to remember something. So it converts it by moving it into what I described as narrative memory. In other words, today I feel it, tomorrow I just talk about it. And so it will separate the emotion, and that is fundamental to emptying stress buckets. So the reason we have this type of sleep in short bursts is because of the amount of, or rather we think, because of the amount of energy used. Because if we did that all night, we would wake up more tired than we went to bed in the first place. So REM empties buckets, important. But remember, we can only have so much REM, and therefore it can't always empty everything. And I wish I had done an extra slide on this. I might come back to this. So imagine when he was talking about, and he drew a little line, didn't he, with the stress at the bottom. If you imagine, so he talked about a traumatic event, and he drew this big thing. But that bucket doesn't need, or isn't only filled to the top and overflowing, so that your taps that he's drawn that release the stress, that doesn't only occur when we have one big traumatic event. That can occur when that line he draws keeps creeping upwards. So imagine day after day after day, we're increasing the stress to the extent that we fill that bucket up. And then imagine our REM sleep in one night can empty one bucket. But if we have created more stress within that day than the REM can empty, then we wake up the next morning with already some stress in the bucket. And if we continually do that, so let's say we create 10 widgets worth of stress in day one, but our bucket only manages 8 and our REM can only empty 8. That means the next day we have 2. We start off with 2, but then we do another 10. So the next day, remember our REM can only empty 8, our bucket can only empty 8. So we carried 2 forward, we had another 10, and now the next day after that, we've got 4. And you can see if that pattern continues, we go from 2 to 4 to 6 to 8. And before we know it, we've got way, way, way more than we can cope with. And that is important to remember. So let's understand how your brain and body define stress. Stress is a word that's liberally sprinkled around like salt on fish and chips. You can tell I'm English, can't you? And everybody assumes that we all know what everybody else is talking about, but I want to define what stress really means, because sometimes we think we're not stressed when we are. And consciously, so the logical part of my brain that understands what I'm doing day by day is a little bit of a blunt instrument. It's not necessarily that perceptive at understanding the tiny stresses that can accumulate in that bucket without me even knowing it. So let's just look at the difference between what I do consciously and what I do unconsciously. So my conscious brain, I want to take as an example breathing. Breathing is an unconscious activity. It just happens. Let's put COVID-19 to one side for a while. Let's not go there. Breathing happens naturally. We don't have to think about it. However, so it happens, if you like, in the unconscious part of our brain. There's a big part of my brain that's taking care of all those unconscious processes that my conscious brain hasn't got the first idea about, hasn't got the foggiest. So my digestion, my heart rate, the flow of blood through my body, the oxygenation, all of that and breathing is taken care of in a way that enables my conscious logical brain to go and do something nice, to choose how I spend my time. But because of that, because my conscious brain is not its primary activity, noticing things like that, but it can interject and intercept on occasion. And breathing is a classic example. I can consciously choose to focus on my breathing. And you probably know that when people get stressed, one of the things even the uninitiated will say is breathe, just breathe. Deep breathing, we're aware, calms us down. But let's look a little deeper. So on this slide, we've got my subconscious that's monitoring all of that stuff that my conscious brain doesn't want to think about, is paying close attention to things like changes in sweat production that do not just respond to heat, but also respond to stress. And that can be so subtle, my conscious brain wouldn't even notice until there was a bucket of sweat dripping down my back. But my unconscious mind notices when there's the tiniest increase in the fingertips and the pads of my thumbs. So that's stress. But not that alone. The unconscious brain is very, very clever, and we're going to look at a sensory pattern matching in a moment. I'll explain that. So it's not simple in that it looks at one thing, goes, oh, it must be stress, we're sweating, because then it would get very confused. No, it's richer than that. It copes with variety. So it's also looking for, is my heart rate higher? Is my heart beating faster? Again, you can say, but this is exercise, Shirley. Well, that happens in exercise. Yes, it does. But your brain is smart. Does it also have shallower breathing? So I listed 3 critical things, and it doesn't really matter that you or I consciously know all those parameters for stress, but what I'm trying to demonstrate is that in the background, your unconscious, if you imagine, it's like an inspector with a checklist, and it's going down its checklist looking for evidence. Does it have this? Check. Does it have that? Check. Does it have the other? Check. And eventually it'll go, oh, I have a match for this. This is stress. And the minute it does that, you've put something in your bucket. So that's the physical side of stress. So it's not just a mental thing, it's a physical thing. And it's fundamental to understand that. Oh, I skipped over one. Right, we're on this one. So let's move into sensory information and pattern matching. This is what I call it, and you'll be completely befuddled, but you will get this. So I've just talked about how the unconscious mind maps stress, and in the video he talks about situations and circumstances and how the mind is clever about, okay, so where is this happening? What are we doing when this is happening? Is the light bright? I can't remember the examples he uses, but it could be, is the grass green? Am I wearing a pink jumper? It's looking at, did I hear a bird? It's looking at all of the sensory information that relates to this particular set of circumstances. And the way it understands the richness and the depth and the variety is way beyond our conscious comprehension. So if you connect that, for example, in the layers and the depth of them, if you think about a rainbow is a simple, basic breakdown of colour through light. 7 colours, that's it. But within those 7 colours, if you were to, if you're choosing a colour on mine as an example, you can choose a myriad of colours. There are colours within colours, within colours, within colours. And every single one of our senses has that depth and complexity. But our conscious mind just goes, is it red or blue or green? We don't need that level of detail consciously, but our subconscious does, because it understands very subtle differences between patterns that will help it define, where do I file this information? Because it categorizes everything we do and everything we see and everything we experience. It categorizes it, says, what is this? Have I experienced something like this in the past? Great. Yes, this looks similar to something else. I'm going to file it with all the other things that relate to this. Let me give you an example. My brain's just gone completely vacant now. An example. Yes, tables and chairs. Simple examples. So something physical. If you think about the way we learn, so this sensory learning, this sensory way of creating patterns and categorizing things and filing them away in our brain is how we learn as human beings from the moment we're born. And what was lovely about that video was he talks about before we're born, which was fantastic. But babies learn intensively with their senses. You can see before they have speech, before they're sent to school, they are touching, tasting, smelling, feeling, they are using their senses to build this library. And what it does initially is it allows them to do things like identify different types of seating and understanding that these are chairs. And you'll see that for a while, a young child doesn't recognize that something's a chair. It's seeing it as a climbing frame. But each time we make a mistake, each time the subconscious is refiling, reassociating, reviewing every single thing we do and every experience we have, so that it can get better and better at refining those libraries, which is magnificent. Because this speeds learning and frees the conscious mind to focus where it wants to focus. And that's what we want, is to be able to focus, to think clearly, to do what we choose to do. And our subconscious is there to help us, except sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it gets those patterns misfiled, misconstrued. And in the video that you've seen before, he gives you examples of how that can happen, which I think are beautiful examples. So remember, remove the word trauma and just think about the situations he's talking about. What triggers stress is different for everyone. Stress triggers stress. So if you go back to my overfilling buckets example, the more stress you have, the more you will be stressed. So it accumulates. So and he uses a beautiful example. In one moment when I'm not stressed, it's not going to bother me. Yeah, really? Oh, that's okay. No, it's not bothering me. But when I'm stressed, then I become bothered by things that didn't bother me before. So stress triggers stress. It's cumulative. And here's where you can start to make a difference. I want you to understand the way your brain works, how it gets you into trouble in the first place, and how that helps you understand what you can start doing to get yourself out of trouble. Because the more you can regain control and focus and clarity and calm down the stress, empty the stress buckets, calm the parasympathetic nervous system, aligned with what we did in module 1, the better able your brain, your conscious brain, will be able to focus on what it is that you really need to be doing, to actually hear what your subconscious mind is telling it. But if you imagine at the moment, when we're stressed, and even if you don't think you're stressed, the fact that you're blocked, and every time you think about that block will be stressing you, it's like you get your computer practicing, well, practicing isn't the word, but engaged in a very, very memory intensive activity, and it whirs and it whirs, and it can't do anything else very quickly, can it? You know, you're pressing the buttons, you're watching it whir, and you're thinking, oh, could you just finish this, whatever it is you're doing in the background there, computer, so that I can get on with what I'm doing and not have to sit here and wait. We all know what that's like, but that's effectively what's going on in your brain when you're blocked and you're stressed and your buckets are overfull and they're not emptying properly, and you don't know why and you don't know how to change it. The more you think or talk about stressful events, the bigger the problems become. And what happens when we get stressed is we want to talk about it. Let me tell you, and we don't realize we're doing it. We revisit every single time we revisit that stressful event. We talk about it again and again. We think about it over and over. We are adding more stress into the bucket. So we experience something once, and every single time we talk about it or think about it, it's as if we've experienced it again. And so we're adding more and more into that bucket. Stress triggers stress. And telling yourself not to think about it, oh, don't think about it, don't think about it. And you're thinking, well, you just told me not to think about it, but I didn't. I said that's how you make it worse. But when you tell yourself not to think about it or to try not to think about it, what you're doing, you're adding the word in not, but the end of that sentence is still the thing that the problem is, the thing that causes you the difficulty, the thing that keeps you stuck. And so what you're doing is encouraging your brain to continue focusing on what you don't want. And as your conscious brain gets more overwhelmed because your unconscious brain is using up all the memory, there's not much left for you to think what you really want. It tries to solve the problem, but it can't solve the problem because the problem isn't in the conscious mind. And because it can't solve the problem, it gets frustrated. And frustration is an emotion that causes physical triggers like sweat production, shallower breathing, heart rate increasing. And remember what that is, that's a stress. And so conscious solution seeking in these circumstances can make the problem worse. I have rattled through this at quite a rate of knots. I will be putting more training into the module to increase clarity, but I suggest you probably listen to this more than once. Any questions? Send them through the Facebook group, the private Facebook group, Midlife Reinvention. Remember, there are 2 groups. One is open, one is private. The private one is for members of this program only. Any questions, drop them in there. You can drop them in the other one if you like, but the best one to drop them in will be in the private group. So if you haven't already joined that group, whether you like Facebook or don't like Facebook, join it just for this, because that's where you will be able to get the support that you need. Okay, finally, I want you to pay attention. So what can you do with all this stuff I've just thrown at you, and your head is probably, what was that? I'm confused. This is what you have to do, your new daily practice on top of your meditation, on top of, meditation so far. All you need to do is pay attention. Notice, are you trying to solve the problem? Are you telling yourself what not to do? I don't do that. Don't think about that. Don't say it. don't do it this way, don't do it that way. If you are telling yourself what not to do, simply notice yourself doing it. Are you telling the story of the problem? Oh, you'll never guess what happened to me today. Oh, that drives me nuts. Oh, are you telling the story of the problem? All I want you to do each and every day is notice it. Nothing more. Just notice it. Because noticing it is the first step to changing it. I've said all along, this is slow, tiny, tiny changes at the conscious level that will allow you eventually to make big changes. But right now it's small changes, so notice it. And then I repeated what I've said in previous videos. Scaling. What number are you at now? Write it down, date it. Repeat it weekly. And there will be another training video where I'm asking you to do this daily, but you must be doing it weekly because you need to scale and measure your progress, and this will help. Okay. Oh, enough of me. That's it. I will see you in another training. Enjoy and don't panic. Stay calm. It's all good. All good.